Last week, my life felt like it had finally come together. After years of working hard, dreaming and planning, I married Kat in the kind of wedding most people can only imagine. It wasn't just big, it was an all-out extravaganza. Kat's family called it an event for the ages. My parents said it was the wedding of the decade. Either way, it was the happiest I'd ever been. We didn't cut corners on anything. The ceremony took place in this gorgeous botanical garden, the kind of place where every picture looks like it belongs on a magazine cover. Kat's dress had taken 3 fittings and hours of adjustments, but when she walked down that aisle, it was like time stopped. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what forever looks like. The reception was just as stunning. There were lights strung up in the trees, a 5-piece band playing everyone's favorite songs, and a buffet so grand that guests kept going back for seconds and thirds. People laughed, danced, and toasted to us well into the night. Michael, the Toastmaster, kept everyone entertained with his humor and charm. I thought he was a great hire. Kat had even mentioned how impressed she was with his energy. Looking back now, those little moments take on a much different meaning, but at the time, it all just felt perfect. And then, there was the house. Both sides of the family had chipped in to make it possible. A newlywed dream home, the kind of place where you imagine your future taking shape. It wasn't just a house. It was a gift wrapped in love and generosity. To me, it symbolized the life Kat and I were about to start together. That night, as we stepped through the door as husband and wife, I couldn't imagine anything ruining the life we were building. For the first few days, everything felt magical. We were still on a high from the wedding, opening gifts, and planning little details for the house. I started thinking about the future, our first holiday together, the memories we'd make, maybe even kids someday running through the halls. It was the kind of happiness that feels so real you don't even question it. Then came Friday. I had gotten off work 3 hours early because of an electrical issue at the job site. It felt like an unexpected little bonus to my day. Since I had some free time, I decided to stop by the grocery store and grab a few things for the weekend. It was a nice day out, the kind where you don't mind running errands. I remember walking the aisles, picking out snacks, and thinking about what Kat might want to eat. Just a regular, simple moment in a life that felt so steady and good. But when I got back to my car, it wouldn't start. The engine just clicked, over and over. I knew the battery had been on its last legs, but I'd kept putting off replacing it. Now I was paying the price. After fiddling with it for a few minutes, I realized there was no quick fix. The house was only a 10-minute walk away, so I figured I'd just leave the car and head home with the groceries. The walk was quiet and uneventful. I passed by the neighbors' homes, waving to Mr. Taylor as he watered his lawn. My mind wandered back to the wedding, replaying the laughter, the music, the vows. I felt a sense of peace, a kind of contentment I hadn't known before. In my head, I started planning out the evening. Maybe we'd make dinner together or just curl up on the couch with a movie. Life felt simple and good. But when I opened the door to our home, that simplicity shattered. There, in the kitchen, stood Kat and Michael. Both of them. Naked. For a second, I couldn't even register what I was looking at. It felt like the kind of scene you only see in bad soap operas or trashy tabloid headlines. But this wasn't TV. This wasn't fiction. This was my life, my house, my wife. My arms felt like lead, my chest hollow. I just stood there, frozen, as they scrambled to cover themselves. Groceries slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a thud, but I barely noticed. My brain tried to make sense of what my eyes were seeing, but there was no explanation, no excuse that could erase what I'd just walked in on. Everything about that moment was wrong. The way Kat's face twisted from shock to panic, the way Michael stammered as he fumbled for his clothes. This was the man who had entertained our guests just a week ago, the man who had toasted to our future. And here he was in my kitchen, in my home with my wife. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I wanted to yell, to scream, to punch something, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. My hands shook so badly the video was probably half blurry, but I didn't care. I wanted proof of what they'd done, proof of the betrayal. Kat started pleading, her voice frantic, but I didn't hear the words. Michael was pale and panicked, mumbling apologies as he grabbed his pants. They looked at me like I was some kind of intruder in my own life, like I was the one ruining something. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just told them to get out before I called the cops. And they did, running out to Michael's car, barely dressed, like a pair of scared kids caught stealing. When they were gone, the silence in the house was deafening. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a complete unraveling of everything I thought my life was. After they ran out, the house felt unbearable. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of everything that had just happened. The groceries were still scattered on the floor, the plastic bag of apples rolling against the counter. I couldn't bring myself to pick them up. I couldn't bring myself to move. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where Kat and Michael had been. A million thoughts ran through my head, all colliding into each other. How could she do this? Why? Had I missed something? Was there some sign I didn't see? We'd just gotten married a week ago. A week. This was supposed to be our honeymoon phase, not whatever this was. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Not because I knew what to do, but because I couldn't just stand there forever. My hands still shook as I grabbed trash bags from under the sink. I walked through the house, room by room, pulling every trace of Kat out of our life. Her clothes, her toiletries, the gifts people had so thoughtfully picked out for us, it all went into the bags. The house we'd been gifted, the home I dreamed of building a life in, suddenly felt like a stranger's space. As I packed her things, I kept replaying the moment I walked in. The look on her face. Half shock, half shame. The way she stumbled over her words, like she thought she could explain it all away. And Michael. Of all people, him. I'd noticed at the wedding that Kat seemed to laugh a little too hard at his jokes, but I brushed it off. I figured she was just being polite, trying to keep the energy up at the reception. Turns out, it wasn't politeness at all. By the time I finished gathering her things, it was nearly dark. I left the bags by the front door and collapsed onto the couch. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking into quicksand. Every corner of the house reminded me of her. Of us. The framed photo from the wedding sat on the coffee table, mocking me with its perfect smiles and promises of forever. I turned it face down. The first person I called was my mom. I didn't even know what to say, but when she picked up, the words just spilled out. I told her everything, what I'd seen, what I'd recorded. Her shock was immediate, her voice breaking as she asked, "How could she do this to you? After everything?" My mom isn't the kind of person to get emotional, but I could hear her trying not to cry. After that, I called Kat's parents. I wasn't trying to shame them, but I felt like they needed to know. They'd been so kind to me, so supportive of our marriage. They deserved to hear the truth, even if it hurt. Her dad didn't say much, just a quiet, "I'm so sorry." Her mom, though, tried to make excuses. Said maybe there was a misunderstanding or that I should wait before jumping to conclusions. That stung more than I expected. Once I had sent the video to both families, there was no turning back. My phone buzzed with messages and missed calls, but I ignored most of them. I couldn't handle the questions, the pity, the anger. I was still trying to process it myself. That night, I slept, or tried to, in the guest room. The bed felt stiff, the air too cold. My mind wouldn't stop replaying everything, over and over. The house, so full of warmth and hope just a week ago, now felt empty and cold. I kept thinking about what I would do next. Did I stay? Did I leave? Did I even want to fight for this marriage? By morning, I had my answer. I packed up the trash bags with Kat's things and drove them to her parents' house. When her dad opened the door, his expression said it all. Tired, sad, ashamed. I handed over the bags without a word. He didn't argue, didn't defend her. He just took them and nodded. Then, I called a real estate agent. The house was a gift, yes, but it didn't feel like one anymore. It felt like a monument to something broken, something I couldn't fix. Selling it wasn't just practical, it was necessary. If I was going to move forward, I couldn't do it there. As the day went on, I started hearing from friends and family. Word was spreading fast, and everyone had an opinion. Some were angry for me, calling Kat every name under the sun. Others told me to take time, not make any rash decisions. A few even asked if I thought I could forgive her. Forgive her? The thought alone made my stomach turn. How could I forgive something like that? But then again, I didn't have the energy to be angry. Not yet. I felt numb, like I was moving through the motions of someone else's life. I rented a small apartment that evening. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for now that was enough. I didn't want to be in that house, surrounded by the ghosts of what could have been. I wanted to start over, even if I had no idea how to do that yet. As I sat on the floor of the empty apartment, scrolling through my phone, a text from Kat popped up. It was long, full of apologies and excuses. She begged me to talk, to meet, to give her a chance to explain. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The day after moving into the apartment, reality hit hard. Sitting there in that unfamiliar empty space, I realized how quickly my life had flipped upside down. Just a week ago, I was unpacking wedding gifts with Kat, laughing about all the mismatched kitchen sets and the dozens of wine glasses people had given us. Now, I was alone, staring at a blank wall, trying to figure out what came next. The calls and texts kept coming. My family was furious, their anger simmering under the surface of every message. My mom, who had adored Kat, was struggling to wrap her head around it. She told me she'd spent the whole night crying, not just for me, but because she felt betrayed too. Kat had been like a daughter to her, and now it felt like a lie. Kat's family was another story. Her dad kept his distance, but her mom wouldn't stop calling. Every voicemail sounded more desperate than the last. She begged me to forgive Kat, saying it was all just a mistake, a lapse in judgment. She's young, her mom said, as if that excused anything. I didn't even know how to respond. Michael's name came up too, though not from him directly. People from the wedding were piecing things together. A few friends who'd stayed late at the reception mentioned how Kat and Michael seemed a little too friendly, lingering near each other when no one was paying attention. I hadn't noticed it at the time. I'd been too caught up in the whirlwind of the night, but hearing it now made my stomach turn. I spent the next couple of days in a haze. The apartment was bare, just a mattress on the floor and a few essentials I'd grabbed on the way out of the house. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Had I missed the signs? Had there been moments where Kat's affection for me had wavered, or was she always this good at hiding it? The video I'd sent out had caused a ripple effect. Kat's family was devastated, and the messages I got from her siblings were a mix of heartbreak and anger. They felt blindsided, just like me. Her brother texted me that he didn't even know what to say but assured me that if he saw Michael, things wouldn't end well. As for Michael, he was nowhere to be found. People started speculating about what would happen to him once word spread, especially since he was in the wedding entertainment business. Who would hire a guy who seduced a bride at her own wedding? One thing became clear. I couldn't stay quiet. I called my family together for a meeting at my parents' house. My brother, my cousins, even my aunt and uncle showed up, their faces a mix of concern and anger. I told them everything. How I'd walked in, what I'd seen, how I'd recorded it. I showed them the video, which was met with a mix of gasps and stunned silence. My brother was the first to speak, saying he couldn't believe Kat had the audacity to do something so low. My cousin asked if I'd even confronted her, or if I planned to meet her. I told them I hadn't, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. My mom held my hand and told me I didn't need to do anything I wasn't ready for. She said Kat had made her bed and now she had to lie in it, no matter how much she begged for another chance. By the end of the meeting, the family made a decision. The house had to go. They'd worked hard to help us buy it, and they couldn't stand the idea of me staying there, surrounded by memories of what Kat had done. My dad volunteered to handle the logistics of putting it on the market. "You focus on getting through this," he said. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through social media. I didn't post anything about what had happened, but the thought of it lingered in the back of my mind. What would people think if they knew? Would they pity me? Judge me? I wasn't sure I could handle either. Then, just as I was about to put my phone down, a message popped up from Kat. She said she was sorry, again. She begged me to meet her, said she needed to explain, to make me understand. She claimed she'd made a terrible mistake but that it didn't mean she didn't love me. "I wasn't thinking clearly," she wrote. "Please, just give me a chance to make it right." I stared at the message for a long time before putting the phone down. She wanted forgiveness, but how do you forgive something like this? How do you move past the image of your wife with another man burned into your brain? I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready to hear her out. Not now. Maybe not ever. By the time I reached my breaking point, the decision to file for divorce wasn't just about what I wanted. It was about what I needed to survive. I had spent enough nights in my empty apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering how the woman I'd just vowed to spend my life with could do something so cruel. At some point, I realized there was no going back. Whatever we'd had, whatever I thought our marriage was, it was gone. Filing for divorce wasn't easy. I had to relive every painful detail when I met with the lawyer. Sitting in his office, surrounded by shelves full of legal books and the faint smell of coffee, I told him everything. I explained how I'd walked in on Kat and Michael, how I'd recorded it, and how I'd left the house because I couldn't stand to stay there. He listened without interrupting, his face calm and neutral, though I could tell he was piecing it all together. When I handed over the video as evidence, he gave a small nod. "This will make things clear in court," he said. "Adultery is hard to argue against when there's proof like this." That gave me a strange sense of validation. It didn't make the betrayal any less painful, but at least I wouldn't have to fight to prove what had happened. From there, the paperwork started. Every form, every signature, felt like another piece of my life being dismantled. The marriage certificate that had once symbolized forever was now just another document to be filed and discarded. One of the hardest parts was discussing the house. My lawyer explained the concept of equitable division, how everything, including the house, would need to be split fairly. Since both our families had contributed to the down payment, things were bound to get complicated. I called Kat's father to explain the situation. He was polite but reserved, his voice strained as he agreed that selling the house was the best option. "I don't think either of you can stay there now," he admitted. I could tell this wasn't easy for him. The house had been a gift of love, and now it was just another casualty of his daughter's choices. Putting the house on the market was bittersweet. When the real estate agent arrived, she walked through the rooms, commenting on the high ceilings, the modern kitchen, and the cozy backyard. All I could see were the memories we'd planned to create there. The family dinners, the holidays, the lazy Sunday mornings that would never happen. The agent assured me it would sell quickly, given the location and the updates we'd made before the wedding. Sure enough, within a few weeks, there were multiple offers. I didn't feel relief though, just a deep sense of loss. The money from the sale would be split between Kat and me, with portions going back to our families to repay their contributions. It felt fair, but fairness didn't make it hurt any less. In the meantime, Kat reached out again. This time, it wasn't just apologies, it was desperation. She asked me to reconsider, begged me to meet with her so we could work through this together. She claimed the affair didn't mean she didn't love me, that it had been a mistake born out of confusion. I told my lawyer about her messages, and he advised me not to engage. "Anything you say to her could complicate the process," he warned. It was good advice, but it didn't make ignoring her any easier. When the court date finally arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. Standing there, hearing the judge read through the details of our short-lived marriage, was surreal. Kat sat across the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She didn't look at me, and I didn't look at her. The division of assets was straightforward, thanks to the evidence I'd provided and the agreement to sell the house. My lawyer ensured I got my fair share, and I made sure my family was repaid for their contributions. As for Kat, I didn't care what she did with her half of the money. For all I knew, she could split it with Michael. When the judge finalized the divorce, there was no sense of triumph. Just a hollow kind of closure. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in just a few weeks. With the money from my share of the house and what I'd saved over the years, I bought a small place on a quiet street. It wasn't much, but it was mine. There was something comforting about starting fresh, even if the thought of building a new life felt overwhelming. As I unpacked my things in the new house, I realized the chapter with Kat was truly over. The vows, the dreams, the plans, they were all just memories now. And while part of me still grieved for what I'd lost, another part of me felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Once the divorce papers were filed and the house went on the market, I thought things might start to settle down. But Kat had other plans. She began reaching out more, sending me long messages, emails, and even voicemails. Every one of them was filled with apologies, pleas for forgiveness, and promises to change. At first, I ignored her. I didn't have the energy to wade through her words or try to parse out whether she was genuine or just desperate. But the messages kept coming. She'd say she couldn't sleep, that she was replaying the moment I walked into the kitchen over and over in her head. She said it had been a mistake, that she was overwhelmed by the wedding, the attention, the pressure of our new life. It was as if she thought putting the blame on stress would make her betrayal easier to stomach. One day, I woke up to find a letter slid under the door of my apartment. It was from Kat. In it, she poured her heart out, or at least, she tried to. She wrote about how lost she felt without me, how she'd made the worst mistake of her life and would do anything to undo it. She claimed Michael didn't mean anything to her, that it was a lapse in judgment, not an affair with real feelings. I didn't believe her. How could I? She didn't just hurt me, she destroyed the foundation of everything we'd been building. And what made it worse was that it hadn't been a random stranger. It was someone from our wedding, someone she'd locked eyes with as we stood at the altar, saying our vows. Her attempts to reconcile didn't stop at letters. She started showing up at my parents' house, hoping to get them on her side. My mom called me after the first visit, her voice a mix of anger and pity. She says she wants to talk to you, Earl. But I told her you need space. My mom, always the peacemaker, sounded torn. She'd loved Kat like a daughter, but even she couldn't look past what had happened. Kat also began messaging some of my closest friends, trying to convince them to talk to me. A few of them forwarded me her texts, unsure of what to do. She seems like she's really sorry, one of them wrote. But sorry didn't fix anything. The worst moment came when she showed up at my workplace. I was in the middle of a meeting when a coworker interrupted, saying there was someone waiting for me in the lobby. I knew who it was before I even got up. Seeing her there, standing in the lobby with tear-streaked cheeks and a shaky smile, made my stomach churn. I told her we couldn't talk there, that it wasn't the time or place. She begged me to hear her out, saying she just needed 5 minutes. I refused and walked away, leaving her standing there. That night, I got another long email. She said she understood why I was angry but insisted that we owed it to ourselves to at least talk. We've been through so much together, Earl, she wrote. We can't just throw it all away. But the truth was, she had thrown it away. And no amount of apologies or explanations could change that. Eventually, I had to set firm boundaries. Through my lawyer, I told her to stop contacting me directly. Any communication about the divorce or the house would have to go through him. It felt harsh, but it was the only way I could start to rebuild my life without her constantly dragging me back into the mess she'd created. As the weeks passed, her attempts slowed down. The messages became less frequent, and the surprise visits stopped. Maybe she finally realized there was no fixing what she'd broken. Or maybe she'd just grown tired of trying. For me, it was a small relief. Each day that passed without hearing from her felt like a step forward, a step closer to reclaiming some semblance of normalcy. I wasn't there yet, but at least I was moving in the right direction. As Kat's attempts to reach out started to fade, I felt like I could finally breathe again. It wasn't an instant shift. There were still moments when my phone buzzed and I braced myself, half expecting another message from her. But over time, the silence became the new normal, and I began to focus on what came next. Selling the house was a significant step toward moving on, but it wasn't without complications. The buyers wanted some repairs done before finalizing the sale, and I had to coordinate everything from my apartment. Being back in that house, even briefly, was harder than I thought it would be. Every room was a reminder of what could have been, from the living room where we'd planned to put up our first Christmas tree to the kitchen where I'd walked in on her and Michael. I hired a contractor to handle the repairs as quickly as possible, not wanting to spend any more time there than I had to. When I handed the keys over to the real estate agent for the final walkthrough, it felt like closing a chapter of my life. The house was no longer my burden, no longer the centerpiece of a future that would never happen. The sale was finalized a week later, and the money for my share came through shortly after. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to give me a fresh start. I used part of it to pay back my parents and Kat's family for their contributions, even though Kat's mom insisted I didn't have to. "You've been through enough, Earl," she said during one of our rare phone calls. But I couldn't keep the money, it didn't feel right. With what was left, I began searching for a new place to call home. I didn't want anything big or flashy, just something simple and comfortable. After a few weeks of looking, I found a small house on a quiet street. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a modest yard, but it felt right. It felt like mine. Moving into that house was a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, it was a fresh start, a chance to build something new. On the other hand, it was a stark reminder of everything I'd lost. The boxes I unpacked were full of memories I wasn't ready to confront. Wedding photos, gifts from friends, and little mementos from the life I'd shared with Kat. I packed most of it away in the attic, unable to decide what to do with it just yet. With the divorce moving forward and the house sold, Kat had fewer reasons to reach out. Still, there were moments where she tried to insert herself back into my life. She'd leave voicemails, saying she hoped I was doing okay or that she still missed me. I deleted them without listening to the whole thing. One day, a mutual friend mentioned she'd seen Kat and Michael together at a bar. It hit me like a punch to the gut, not because I still cared, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected all along. Whatever she'd told me about their mistake, and her regret didn't matter. She hadn't chosen me, she'd chosen him. Hearing that was oddly freeing. It gave me a sense of closure, even if it wasn't the kind I'd hoped for. I didn't need to wonder what could have been or whether I'd made the right choice by walking away. She'd made her decision, and now I was making mine. I poured my energy into the new house, fixing it up little by little, painting the walls, planting flowers in the yard, and even tackling some small DIY projects. It wasn't about creating the perfect home, it was about creating my home, a place where I could rebuild and move forward. I also started focusing on myself in ways I hadn't before. I joined a gym, partly to stay busy and partly to burn off the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. I picked up a few new hobbies, like hiking and cooking, things I'd never made time for during the chaos of the past few months. Slowly but surely, I was reclaiming my life. It wasn't easy, and there were still nights where the weight of everything kept me awake. But each day felt like a small step forward, a reminder that the future was mine to shape, free from the shadow of what had happened. Kat was no longer the center of my world. She was a chapter I'd closed, a lesson I'd learned. And with each passing day, I felt a little closer to the man I wanted to be. The man I knew I could become, even after everything I'd been through. Life has a strange way of moving forward, even when you feel stuck. For months, I had been focusing on rebuilding, fixing up my new house, sticking to a routine, and keeping myself busy. Slowly but surely, things started to shift. The first big change was my new job. I landed a position in project management at a smaller, family-owned firm. It wasn't flashy, but the difference was night and day compared to my last workplace. My boss actually cared about his employees, and the team was welcoming from day one. People took the time to show me the ropes, and the environment was low pressure, the kind where you could make a mistake without fearing it would ruin your career. For the first time in a long time, I didn't dread getting up in the morning. With work going well, I started to focus more on myself. Joining the gym had been one of those new year, new me ideas I almost didn't follow through on, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made. At first, it was awkward. I didn't know the machines, I felt out of place, and every part of me ached the next day. But over time, I got into a rhythm. I stuck with it, lifting weights, running on the treadmill, and seeing small improvements week after week. It wasn't just about getting stronger. It was about having something to pour my energy into. On days when the memories crept back in, when I felt like the past was weighing me down, the gym became my escape. The clang of weights and the steady rhythm of my runs drowned out the noise in my head. And the best part? I started feeling better. Not just physically, but mentally too. It was during one of those gym sessions that I met Nora. I wasn't paying attention as I walked toward the locker room, still half lost in my post-workout days, and I nearly bumped right into her. She stepped back, laughing softly and saying something about me being in the zone. I apologized, feeling embarrassed, but she just waved it off like it was no big deal. There was something about her. This easy, unassuming confidence. She didn't try too hard, didn't act like she had something to prove. She was just comfortable. I saw her again a week later, this time at the grocery store. She was standing in the produce aisle, holding 2 different kinds of apples and looking like she was trying to solve a puzzle. I almost walked past, but something stopped me. I stepped closer and joked that I hoped she was better at making decisions than I was when it came to apples. She looked up, surprised, and then laughed. a real, genuine laugh that felt like it could brighten the whole store. We started talking, first about apples, then about the best ways to pick fresh produce, and eventually about ourselves. I learned that she was a teacher who'd recently moved to the neighborhood, that she loved hiking and trying new recipes. She had this way of talking that made every word feel light but meaningful at the same time. When she mentioned she lived a few streets over from my place, I was surprised. I'd never noticed her before, but then again, I hadn't been paying much attention to my surroundings lately. She made a joke about how small worlds, like this, were either fate or just bad luck. I laughed and told her I was leaning toward fate. As we stood there in the produce aisle, chatting like old friends, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: ease. There wasn't any pressure, no awkwardness. It was just two people having a conversation that felt natural. I didn't ask for her number that day. I wasn't sure if I was ready. But as I walked out of the store with my groceries, I couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something about Nora that stayed with me, like a quiet reminder that maybe, just maybe, good things were still possible. For the first time in months, life felt like it was moving forward, not in leaps and bounds, but in steady, hopeful steps. Over the next couple of weeks, life continued to find a new rhythm. Work stayed steady, the gym remained my go-to outlet, and my house was slowly starting to feel more like home. But despite everything going well, I couldn't stop thinking about Nora. I kept replaying our conversations in my head, the way she laughed, the ease with which she spoke, and how everything about her felt so genuine. It wasn't like I was suddenly head over heels, but there was a spark, a pull I couldn't ignore. One Friday after work, I decided to stop by the same grocery store where I'd last seen her. Not because I was expecting to run into her again, but maybe, just maybe, I was hoping for it. I wandered through the aisles longer than usual, picking up things I didn't really need. By the time I hit the produce section, I figured it was a long shot. But then, there she was. She was in the dairy aisle this time, crouched down and squinting at the expiration dates on a row of yogurt containers. For a second, I froze, unsure if I should say anything. But then she looked up, saw me, and smiled. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Apple Expert," she teased. I laughed, feeling a mix of relief and nerves. We struck up another conversation, this time about her ongoing mission to find the perfect yogurt. She was surprisingly passionate about it, making me laugh as she described how most brands were either too watery or too bland. As we talked, I felt that same sense of ease from before. There was no awkwardness, no trying to impress each other. Just two people connecting. Before we parted ways, I decided to take a chance. I mentioned how nice it was running into her again and asked if she'd like to grab coffee sometime. For a split second, I worried she might say no, that I'd read the situation wrong. But then she smiled and said, "I'd like that." We exchanged numbers, and as I walked out of the store, I felt lighter than I had in months. It wasn't just about Nora, it was about taking a step forward, about allowing myself to let someone new into my life. That weekend, I texted her, suggesting a cafe nearby that I'd heard good things about. She replied almost immediately, saying it sounded great. We set a time for the following Saturday, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I had something to genuinely look forward to. The week leading up to our coffee date flew by. Work kept me busy, and I continued to stick to my gym routine, but there was a new energy behind it all. For once, it felt like the weight of the past wasn't the only thing driving me forward. There was something brighter on the horizon. Something, or maybe someone, worth reaching for. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was nervous but excited. Meeting Nora felt like more than just a date. It felt like a chance to rewrite what the future could look like. Saturday morning arrived, and with it came a wave of nerves I hadn't felt in years. Meeting Nora wasn't just about grabbing coffee. It felt like a test of whether I was really ready to let someone new into my life. As I got dressed, I second-guessed everything. Was my shirt too casual? Should I have gone with something more formal? Was meeting at a cafe too low-key? Eventually, I shook off the overthinking, stuck with a simple button-down, and headed out. The cafe was cozy and inviting, with warm wooden tables and the faint smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. I got there a little early, found a table by the window, and spent a few minutes watching people pass by on the street. When Nora walked in, it was like the room instantly felt lighter. She was wearing a casual sundress and carrying a leather tote bag slung over her shoulder. She smiled when she saw me, that same easy, genuine smile that made everything else feel less complicated. After ordering, she got a chai latte, I stuck with plain black coffee. We settled into conversation. At first, we talked about the basics. Work, favorite hobbies, how long we'd lived in the area. She told me about her job as a teacher and how much she loved working with kids, even if the early mornings were brutal. She had this way of telling stories that made even the most ordinary moments sound interesting. I found myself laughing more than I had in months. At one point, I asked if she'd always wanted to be a teacher. She admitted it wasn't her first choice. She'd initially wanted to go into art history but decided on teaching after volunteering at a summer program for kids. It just felt right, she said, her voice soft but certain. When the conversation shifted to me, I was hesitant at first. Talking about myself felt strange, like I was peeling back layers I wasn't sure I wanted to expose. But Nora listened without judgment, genuinely interested in what I had to say. I didn't dive into everything that had happened with Kat, but I did mention that I'd recently been through a tough breakup. Nora nodded thoughtfully and said, "Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan, but that doesn't mean we can't find something better on the other side." It wasn't a deep revelation, but the way she said it stuck with me. We stayed at the cafe for nearly 2 hours, sipping our drinks and talking like old friends. By the time we finished, I realized I hadn't once thought about the past, about the pain or the betrayal. For those 2 hours, it was just me and her, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company. As we walked out, I offered to walk her to her car. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the street, and I couldn't help but think about how different this moment felt from anything I'd experienced in the last year. When we reached her car, there was a small pause. I thanked her for meeting me, and she smiled, saying she'd had a great time. For a moment, I thought about asking her if she wanted to go out again, but she beat me to it. "Next time," she said with a grin, "you're picking a spot with good desserts." "Deal." I laughed and agreed, watching as she got into her car and drove off. Walking back to my own car, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. It wasn't just about Nora, it was about taking a step forward, about proving to myself that the future could hold something good, something new. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the date in my head, a small smile creeping onto my face. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something worth holding on to. The days following my first date with Nora felt different, lighter. It was as if I'd finally shaken off some of the weight I'd been carrying for months. Work didn't feel like such a grind, my gym sessions had more energy, and even the small, quiet moments at home didn't feel so empty. Nora and I started texting regularly, not constant or overwhelming, just small messages that brightened my day. She had a way of making even the mundane feel interesting. One morning, she sent me a picture of her mismatched socks with the caption, "This is what happens when I get dressed before coffee." It made me laugh in the middle of a work meeting, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized I was smiling without forcing it. We planned our second date for the following weekend. True to her suggestion, I picked a dessert spot, a small bakery I'd heard about but never visited. When she showed up, she teased me about how seriously I'd taken her request. "You went all out," she said, eyeing the display case filled with pastries and cakes. We shared a slice of chocolate torte and a few macarons, joking about which flavors were hits and which were misses. But it wasn't just the food that made the evening memorable, it was the ease of being around her. There was no pressure, no pretending. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just be myself. During one of our conversations, I mentioned the house I'd recently bought and how I was slowly making it my own. Nora lit up, asking about my progress and throwing out suggestions. "You've got to add plants," she said. "They make any space feel alive." I laughed, telling her I barely kept my groceries from going bad, let alone plants. She rolled her eyes and said, "It's not that hard. Start with a pot hose. They're practically indestructible." The conversation drifted to our shared love of hiking, and before the night ended, we'd loosely planned to hit a nearby trail together the following weekend. As we said goodbye, there was a moment, just a small, fleeting one, where I thought about leaning in for a kiss. But I hesitated, unsure if it was too soon. Nora smiled, seeming to sense my pause, and gave me a warm hug instead. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in a whirlwind head-over-heels kind of way, but in a steady, comforting sense. She felt different, not like a rebound or a distraction, but someone real. Someone who made me want to show up as the best version of myself. In the meantime, life kept moving forward. Work continued to go well, and I was getting more comfortable with the team. My boss even complimented me on a project I'd led, saying it was some of the most efficient work they'd seen in months. It wasn't a big thing, but it felt good to be recognized. At the gym, I was pushing myself harder. It wasn't about looking a certain way or proving anything to anyone. It was about showing myself that I was capable of growth, of strength. I started setting small goals, like increasing the weight I could lift or running just a little farther each time. Progress wasn't always fast, but it was there, and that was enough. One day, while cleaning out a storage box, I stumbled across some old photos from the wedding. For a moment, I froze, unsure if I should toss them or hold on to them. Eventually, I decided to keep them tucked away in the box. Not out of sentimentality, but because they were part of my story, even if it was a painful one. The difference now was that they didn't feel like the end of the story. Meeting Nora, focusing on my own growth, and rebuilding my life. Those things reminded me that there was still so much ahead. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the upcoming hike with Nora, about how much my life had changed since that devastating day in the kitchen. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and hurt, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in. Things with Nora just kept getting better. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how right it felt. It wasn't just the little things, like her bringing over her favorite books or adding a few plants to the windowsills. It was the way she made everything feel more peaceful. There was this quiet warmth she brought into my life, and I didn't realize how much I needed that until she was there. A few months later, when we started spending more and more time together, Nora offered to move in with me. It wasn't a big conversation, it just felt natural. She'd been staying over so often, and we both liked how easy everything was between us. So, she moved in. The whole process felt surprisingly smooth. Her things mixed with mine, and the house started to feel like a real home, our home. With Nora living with me, everything else in my life started falling into place, too. Work was going better than ever. I was handling more projects, and people at the office were noticing. It felt good to be respected for my work again after everything that had happened. The gym had become my escape, my routine, and I was seeing real results. I was stronger, faster, and felt healthier than I had in years. It wasn't just about the physical changes. I could feel my confidence building back up. Nora and I kept getting closer. She was always there when I needed to talk, and there was no drama. We had the kind of relationship where we could just be ourselves. No games, no pretenses. It felt easy. I remember one night, sitting on the couch with her after a long week, just watching a movie and laughing at the dumb jokes. It hit me then, I was happy. It wasn't just about her, though she was a huge part of it. It was about feeling at peace with myself, with my life. I wasn't dragging around that heavy weight anymore. I was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like things were exactly where they should be.